Russian power seems to be diminishing in the Middle East with the fall of the Assad dynasty. How does the region look on the Kremlin situation maps? Have they foreseen and prepared for this eventuality? What are the calculations that they are making given the fluidity of events? Join me, Darasz, for How We Got Here.
Over the last century, first the Soviet Union, then Russia, have created a chain of friendly countries across North Africa and the Middle East. But with President Bashar al-Assad overthrown after a 24-year rule, an important link in Russia's network has been broken. Bashar al-Assad succeeded his father, Hafez al-Assad, in July 2000. He continued his iron fist rule of the country despite the Arab Spring that triggered the Syrian civil war in March 2011. The revolt was triggered by government corruption, totalitarian rule, political repression and state-sponsored sectarianism, among others. The al-Assad family itself represents an Arab ethno-religious group that follows Alawism, a religious sect that splintered from early Shia Islam. Since the al-Assads have lost their grip of the country, large swathes of its territory are now unclaimed by any forces vying for power in Syria. These are the opposition Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, Turkey-backed Syrian National Army and the predominantly Kurdish Syrian Democratic Forces, but also other minor rebel groupings. As rebels celebrate the long-awaited victory in Aleppo, Homs, Damascus and across the whole country, the fate of Russian bases in Syria is yet to be written. There are two major Russian bases in Syria. First the Hmeimim air base and second the naval base in Tartus. Established in 2015, Hmeimim is crucial for Russia's projection of power in the region. The base allows for carrying out airstrikes, contributing to 75% of Moscow's capabilities in Syria, according to a Russian war blogger. Moscow has also used the base as a waypoint during its military contractors' trips in and out of Africa. The Soviet Union established a facility in Tartus during the Cold War in accordance with the Soviet-Syrian agreement concluded in 1971, with a view of supporting the Soviet Navy in the Mediterranean. As Russia wrote off 73% of Syria's more than $13 billion Soviet-era debt in 2005 and became Syria's main arms supplier, the two countries held talks about allowing Russia to develop and enlarge its naval facility so that Russia could strengthen its naval presence in the Mediterranean. Amid the Russo-Georgian war and plans to deploy a US missile defense shield in Poland, al-Assad agreed to the port's conversion into a permanent Middle East base for Russia's nuclear-armed warships. The naval base is Russia's sole Mediterranean repair and replenishment hub. Losing this base would cripple Russia's ability to project power in the Mediterranean and Africa. While the situation around the bases remains tense, Syrian opposition leaders have allegedly guaranteed their safety and that of diplomatic institutions.
Russian military bases in Syria are on high alert. At the moment, there is no serious threat to their safety.
Losing these bases would come as a maiming blow to Russia's long-worked-out reputation. Russia's military intervention in the Syrian civil war was a military muscle flex that restored Moscow to the position of an international warden. Russia inflated that image to advertise itself as an alternative to the West and the US in the Middle East and Africa. With Bashar al-Assad taking cover in Moscow and his regime toppled, Moscow may have to get its great power ambitions out of its head.
It's a great pleasure to welcome once more Witold Rodkiewicz, a senior fellow at the Russian Department of the Center for Eastern Studies. Great to have you once again. Welcome.
Thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure.
Were you as surprised as you say the Russians were about the fall of the Assad dynasty in Syria?
Well, it's not really very modest of me, but I had this feeling from the first days of this offensive. After 2 days, 3 days, I thought it's really looked like this might lead to this, although, okay, I didn't think it was a given on the last days of November, but I thought this had a promise of something like that. But I think the Russians were completely surprised, and there were lack of reaction in the first days, and then what happened afterwards suggests to me they were completely surprised. And I think this is very interesting because they shouldn't have been, because we know that they have heavy presence, that they have advisors deployed with Syrian army units. It's not only that they are in the bases, but that they had people in the field. And it indicates to me that either these people were completely unprofessional and completely unqualified, or the Russian command structure is not working, namely their reports were not getting through.
Well, yes, I mean, is this an institutional failure that we see in many intelligence agencies by just telling the authorities what they want to hear rather than playing out the black scenario?
Yes, and especially we see this in authoritarian regimes. Because this was clearly the question of total demoralization of the army. I mean, from the first, but it was sort of, you could see that from the first day. I mean, these guerrillas or these fighters didn't really have much heavy equipment.
Yes, they're very lightly armed.
And lightly armed. They had drones. That's true. But that's another thing. After the Russians were there since at least 2015. I mean, there were serious military presence. And then since 1922, we know that the Russian army is sort of capable and has been taking into account and adjusting to the fact of the massive use of drones. But in Syria, they were completely surprised, and the Syrian army was completely surprised. So that tells me that something is not working in the whole structure in terms of passing the experience and the new ways of doing things.
In a sense, they've not lost they've not learned the lessons of their early campaign in Ukraine.
Right, but they seem to be learning that in Ukraine, but not here. There are some rumors that in fact the assignment to Syria was a kind of punishment during the last few years. People who were sent there because we're not really wanted in their structures. So that might be, but I think it's a more systemic failure, and I think it's an optimistic sign from our point of view, because it indicates that the typical rot of a authoritarian dictatorial system is really present there, and it's eating away the intestines of the system.
What do we know about this group that overthrew the Assad regime?
Well, the leading group is Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is a group that originally arose as a part of al-Qaeda network. So they were 2015, I think, or maybe even earlier. They were put on the terrorist list both at the UN and Department of State. It's official, and the guy who's heading it actually has a kind of a price on his head, American price on his head. They were already a serious force in 2000, during the previous the phase of the civil war. They survived the military defeat of 2015-2017 relatively best. They were then withdrew to Idlib, where there was this part of an intricate arrangements which took place around 2017 between Turkey, Russia, and Iran, and the Syrian opposition. So they withdrew to this Idlib demilitarization zone, where they were supposed to be disarmed by the Turkish forces. Their relationship with Turkey is ambiguous. On the one hand, the Turks are using them and are supporting them. On the other hand, they are trying to control them, and there are clashes between them and the Turkish forces. So it's not like they are puppets of the Turks. They are an independent actor, but again, relying on the Turkish supplies and the logistics and so on and so on. But I think what was a surprise to me was how they behaved from the first day of this offensive. First of all, they clearly managed to organize an effective political military force. Second, they clearly organized. They had good operational planning, clearly. And the most important thing and the most surprising was their political behavior. In other words, they made an extra effort to persuade everyone. Syria is a very variegated society. There are a lot of sects, a lot of minorities, that they are not going to repeat their policies that they demonstrated earlier, namely the persecution of those that they regard as being the dissidents within the Islam and anti-Christians and so on. So they basically offered and promised toleration, protection, and they made a point of not committing any acts of, ethnic cleansing or inter-community violence. I've heard from a good source that the first thing they did when they entered Damascus was to put armed guards next to Christian churches so that there would be no violence. And basically they were using phraseology and slogans that were very non-divisive.
That would please the West.
Well, I'm not so sure the West. I think this was their strategy because this made this process of gaining control and defeating the army, and the fact that the army didn't fight,
yes, it could
and the local communities didn't fight. They just sort of joined them, but in return they were sort of not interfered with. Like Ismailis, for example, the one of the sects that have. So they were in that sense. So they had this very unifying platform that they used. How this is going to work out next, we don't know.
See.
But this is interesting. As far as I understand, even Americans are not completely they don't have a negative attitude towards that. They seem to be willing to give them the benefit of the doubt at the moment.
What's the it's seen as a defeat for a diplomatic, certainly a military defeat for Russia. Is that accurate? And what are the ramifications of this? Are they out for good from Syria?
The ramifications are huge. The Russian position in the Middle East, which they built up after 2015, relied almost exclusively on their image as an effective operator who can provide effective military help, who can save clients and allies, who can threaten opponents with effective use of military force. This is gone. This is gone. I mean, they turned out to be completely marginalized, and it's kind of, it's kind of really very, very compromising, I would say. I mean, in the sense that they were there, they've been there since 2015. They had military presence, 2 bases, military advisors in practically entire Syrian army, every division. They had units that were patrolling northeastern parts of Syrian border with Turkey. And it turns out that this was, they were not incapable of doing anything to stop this.
Is that going to send a tremor of doubt throughout Russia's existing allies, Belarus, for example?
Well, I'm not sure about that, but definitely their position in Syria gave them direct leverage over three important actors. Over Israel, because Israel, which wanted to attack Iranian aims in Syria, had to sort of negotiate with Russia access because of the Russian anti-aircraft batteries at these bases. So this was intricate exchange of favors. So they could not. Russia was important for them. I mean, vitally important. Turkey, because the same situation. From the Turkish point of view, the most important issue in Syria was the presence of the Kurdish units and organizations that are tied with the PKK, that is the separatist Marxist guerrilla force that's fighting against Turkey. So they wanted to pursue them in Syria, and that, again, that required Russian green light. And third, Iran, which is, for Iran, Russia was an indispensable partner in Syria, because without Russian participation, Iranians wouldn't have been able to save Assad and to save their corridor, which allowed them to transfer weapons, people, and so on, from Iran to Hamas in Lebanon. Now, with Russia not able, with Assad gone, Russia is no longer so necessary for Iran, and this common fight against Assad's opponents in Syria was the glue that really made this very instrumental and pragmatic and complicated Iranian-Russian partnership into well, maybe not a real alliance, but it was an important glue in this to cement this relationship. I wonder, I mean, there is a new agreement on cooperation and friendship between Russia and Iran that's been prepared, in the process of being prepared and negotiated in the last several years. They announced it was supposed to be signed during the next visit of Iranian president in Russia. I wonder what will happen with this now. Other Arab states, Gulf monarchies, everyone needed to talk to Russia, needed to felt that you cannot really alienate Russia, and you don't want to cross Russia in any way. And that was important, because that was the basis on which the Russians built relationships, which they used to first counter Western strategy of diplomatic isolation after their attack on Ukraine, and second, the Western strategy of economic sanctions. So, using those connections, the Russians were either replacing the various trade ties that they lost with the West, or even try to circumvent sanctions. And those countries were helpful because they wanted Russia, because it was in Syria, it was a player, everyone wanted favors. This is the end. And if Russia loses the basis, which is still not clear, because I think the Russians would do a lot to retain those bases, and I think they are going to enter into bargaining process with whom they call Islamic terrorists. Basically, their offer would be to, it's very clear, their offer is going to be that they are going to provide them with help in legitimizing them internationally because of their seat in the Security Council in the UN. They can hinder or move forward the process of their delisting from the terrorist list, for example. Even if the Russians are successful in renegotiating their presence in Syria and retain their bases, I'm sure they're not going to retain the conditions under which they got them from the Assad regime, using complete dependence of the Assad regime on them, because the terms are completely neo-colonial, and no normal, legitimate, independent government of any country would agree to have foreign bases on the conditions that were imposed by the Russians in 2017.
Yes, you mentioned it was a neo-colonial structure. It's like America and Vietnam, really. They're scuttled out.
Yes, there are some similarities.
We can discuss. Certainly, it's a dynamic situation, so we'll discuss that certainly next time. Thank you very much, Witold Rodkiewicz, for coming on to the program. So that's it. Join us next time for How We Got Here.